I think we're good. I think
Oh,
we're
yep.
up.
Live on Facebook. All right. Excellent. Oh my goodness. Thank you everyone who
We made it.
yes, we made it. We made it. Thank you everyone who is bearing with us and bearing with me. For those who don't know me, my name is Keisha Brown, and I'm the founder and owner of Justice Connection, and also very technologically challenged. And so, despite my best tries, I just be tinkering, tinkering, tank. But I thank my guests too, Adam Jackson, who is the dynamic leader of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. So I thank you for being here and patient this evening.
No problem.
Yeah, so we're going to jump in, but I do want folks to um, try and figure out the inspiration behind the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle name. As soon as I saw you guys, before I knew anything about you guys, I was like, wait a second. Okay, I see what y'all are doing here. We're near and dear to my heart.
Mhm.
So I'm going to let you just tell us a little bit about your background. And it was really important, Adam, for me to bring your voice to the Justice Connection community,
Mhm.
because when we talk about justice and when we talk about the Black community and communities of color, especially in this time that we're in, we cannot not talk about the police. And one of the things that people have been shooting around most recently is this notion of defunding the police, right? And so
Mhm.
for some people, it's a new thought, right? That they
Right.
never thought was possible, that they are extremely excited about. There are other folks who are like, how dare you? Who am I going to call if something happens? We need the police. And so I know that you've been in the trenches, if you will, in Baltimore, really doing the work and really connecting on a firm grassroots level. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, give us a little bit of background on yourself so
Mhm.
folks can be introduced to you personally and your work. And then we'll dive right in, about what defunding the police really means and how do we redesign this whole institution.
Got you. Appreciate it. So first, all the people that are viewing online, peace and blessings. My name is Adam Jackson. I am the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I appreciate Keisha's invitation to have this discussion tonight. It's LBS for short. That's the short name. It's a lot of syllables in that title. So Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, LBS. We're a grassroots political organization and more specifically a think tank. And so a lot of our work focuses on public policy and legislation and making sure that we advocate for that policy and legislation in the best interests of the Black community. We've been around for about 10 years. So since 2010, August of this year, we'll make our 10-year anniversary. So that's
Excellent.
pretty exciting.
Excellent.
And, in terms of the work that we've been doing over the years, to reference some of the stuff you said, Keisha, we've actually been doing policy advocacy at the local and state level the entire time we've been around. And so to kind of give you some highlights, one of the very first things we actually did was helping stop the construction of a $104 million youth detention facility that
That's
was
right.
going to be built in East Baltimore for youth charged adults. And after that, over the course of the next few years, we spent a lot of time working directly with now Senator, then Delegate Jill P. Carter on a variety of issues. We consider her one of our mentors. And she actually worked more specifically with us on helping pass one of the first bills we did pass was the Christopher's Law, named after Christopher Brown, a young Black man who was murdered by Baltimore County Police, I believe in 2012. And
Right.
that law that got passed at that time was focusing on some of the things that people are talking today, cultural sensitivity, cultural competency in law enforcement, which today is a very central piece to how people are talking about how law enforcement encounters community. So there's that. And some of the other things that we worked on, there's been bail reform that we were successful at in 2017. There's also been more recently attempting to fight and beat back the creation of Johns Hopkins University's private police force, which unfortunately passed last year, but we're still trying to make sure that it's not actually going to come to fruition. And there's other things that aren't criminal justice that we work on too. So that we'll create the Black Arts and Entertainment District on Pennsylvania Avenue, and there's also our participation in the Children and Youth Fund here in Baltimore, which is aiming to get more resources to Black and grassroots organizations here in the city. So there's a variety of things that we've been doing over the years. For people who want to know more about me, I am originally from Baltimore. I went to Towson University for my college career, and it was through those experiences at Towson, because if you're Black and from Baltimore, you know a little bit about Towson, how Towson gets down. We could talk about that another time, but so those experiences there, my experiences in policy debate, and competing around the country in college, really informed my perspective and why I wanted to get involved in legislation and policy when I got out. So that's kind of the quick and dirty for people. Oh, and the name. Oh, the name comes from Talib's Kweli.
Don't say it. Don't say it.
Oh, my bad.
They were supposed to guess it. They were supposed to guess.
My fault. But
fair enough. All right, good. Well, just a couple of the things, right? A couple of the things that you're working on. And to your point about the Johns Hopkins police force, I read the other day that they decided that they were halting that apparently, and that they were not moving forward with that, I read.
So what happened was the legislation that got passed, it enabled Johns Hopkins University to create the police force. And some people kind of thought that meant tomorrow that they were going to create it. But in order for them to create it, they actually had to write the MOU with the city that kind of lays out the plans and how it's going to operate. And so, and also there's the funding of the actual department in and of itself. And so because of the pandemic and, some of the conversations that have been happening, I think they just were being politically shrewd, and we're just like, well, maybe not this year, maybe in a couple of years, because we lost a lot of revenue.
Right. So let's jump in. When we talk about defunding the police. So we had a previous discussion on Justice Connection, and folks were really wondering, what does this mean, right? You're hearing it on CNN, you're hearing it on MSNBC, you're hearing it on Fox, that's your flavor, right? And you're hearing these new ideas about how do we handle the institution that we know of as the police. And through that, we're also learning a lot about, for a lot of people, they're learning a lot about the history of police in this country, its origins, especially as it relates to the Black community. And so here we are, fast forward 2020, and now we're talking about defunding one of the most highly funded, right, institutions in most governments. And so one of the things that I want us to talk about, Baltimore is a great example, quite frankly, of the police. And part of my background, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I used to be the director of civil rights for Baltimore City. And in that capacity, I was director of the Baltimore Civilian Review Board, which was the only authority in the city that could review police complaints. And that is we can dive into that too in another time. I can't wait to write my tell-all book, because I tell you, it was a really interesting experience being at that vantage point in dealing with the police. And I'll say that when I first started out, actually throughout my tenure there, and I would go into the community, and it never failed that an older Black man or Black woman would pull me to the side at the end of my presentation, and they would say, "Be careful." They were praying for you, sister, because they knew enough about the police and how over the years they had terrorized Black people in that city. And any type of action to change that, anything that was coming to blow, any type of wind that was not of their bidding, could be met with dire consequences, right?
Right.
I take that very seriously, right? So when we talk about defunding the police, it's not just willy-nilly. We're not just throwing stuff out there. There's an actual, there's been a lot of great thought put into this, right? I know, Adam, through policy work, through legislative efforts, through the work that you guys are doing as a think tank, around the notion of taking money, right? Because funding, we're talking about money essentially, taking it out of the police department, right? I'll give a quick story before I want you to really dive into your perspective on defunding the police. But when I was director of civil rights, right? So I started in February, March. It was about a month, a little bit of over a month before the Freddie Gray uprising. And we got our budgets over the summer. And by December, the end of the year, this is 2015, we as department heads were instructed to stop spending money because the police had already overspent their budget. And we were only months into the year, the fiscal year, right? And so when one entity has that much power over an entire city, that every other agency, literally every other agency, is directed to stop spending money, right? That is when we get into the crux of what is the funding mechanism, what is the funding apparatus as it relates to the police and the entire budget, right? So Adam, I'd like to hear your perspectives on defunding the police as you see it as someone who's been engaged on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything you offered just now, I think, is really good context for people who may be unfamiliar with that dynamic. Because, you know, the place we got to start at is just to kind of set the tone for how we're talking about defunding the police, is that, you know, defunding the police has become the new popular conversational piece for people who call themselves advocates and activists. And there are a lot of people who have not been engaged at the policy level who are talking now about, you know, hashtag defund the police. And so when, you know, and there's a variety of different contexts and conversations that you can have about what that actually means. To some people, defund the police means abolishing police departments. That means like literally removing police departments and having a different approach to community safety.
Taking it down to zero.
Right, like there's no police departments. Right. And there's been examples of people of a city doing that, Camden, New Jersey, where they abolished or removed the police department. And in that instance, even though they quote unquote abolished the police department, the new agency that took its place ended up essentially repeating and perpetuating some of the same problems. So this question of defunding the police or even abolishing the police comes down to a question of infrastructure, because when you say defund something, the implication is that you want to invest in something different. And the question should be like, okay, well, if we are defunding the Baltimore City Police Department, then what are we going to invest in instead? And I think that is the kind of gap that we're standing at the moment, is that a lot of people are supporting the idea of defunding police departments for the reasons that you described. You know, Baltimore City Police Department's budget is about $500 million. It's a third of the entire Baltimore City budget.
You said half of what?
$500 million. What up? B. $500 million. Right. And most people when they hear that, they're like, no, what? You know. Right. Yeah. And so there are very specific mechanics involved, you know, because one thing that the police commissioner said, I believe, at one of the recent hearings on the budget for his department, he said that, yeah, $180 million of that budget is stuff that we can't really even touch, because it's like pensions, it's things that are attached to like healthcare benefits and other things that, you know, as employees that you know, of the city government and state that you know, that they're entitled to. So there's $180 million they've siphoned off, and a lot of that stuff is cut off because of the, you know, the labor agreement that the city has with the Fraternal Order of Police. And so there's that. And then there's the mechanics of, so are you telling Black people, you know, we're going to take away the police and then you're going to invest in what instead? And, you know, one of the dynamics I think that play is, you know, if you ask Black people, if you ask the average Black person who is not familiar with any of these things, do they want more police or less police? With nothing else there, with nothing to stand in the middle as an alternative, most Black people would say more police. You know, we're not talking about Black people that want police to brutalize Black folks. We're talking about Black people that want their community to be safe. And so that's
right.
Exactly. And that's what I think people, exactly. That's the thing that people are missing out on. They're missing out on the perspective of people's grandmothers and aunties and family members who live in working class communities, who all they see is violence and they want their community to be safe. Given an alternative, I think Black people would choose something different. But that's kind of been the gap. And so one of the things that we've been saying is that in order to make sure that we're investing in something that's an alternative, we have to build the infrastructure for it. So that way our community, we can still meet the need of community safety, but we don't need police to do it. That's kind of been the back and forth.
Right. I mean, when we talk about not needing police to do it, that last phrase that you just said, I think about all the things that police do that we don't necessarily need them to do. One, because there are other people that already do it. And there are already other professionals also who do it. Like that is their specific expertise. For all of you who've joined us, thanks for being a part of this discussion. Albeit late, that is me, non-tech Keisha Brown. But I want to remind you to like and share the video and give a thumbs up if you're listening so we can see you out there. And I want you to say in the comments, I want to hear from you. I know this isn't just us talking, but it's really about this concept of defunding and redesigning what policing looks like. And so what is it? I'm going to give an example. Adam, I want you to give one too. And then I want also everybody in the comments to be able to share what's an example of something that somebody else already does that we don't need the police to also do, right? That they're currently doing, right? So I'll give an example. I have contributed more money than I wish to municipalities all over the state of Maryland through traffic tickets, right? So I get those speeding tickets all the time from the cameras. But on this particular day, I was going to the park and the parking lot was full except for this one space where the lines were drawn to sort of like little white lines, like not to park, but it was faded out. So I said to myself, oh, it's little old town. I'm gonna be there for an hour. Let me just park here. Now, mind you, I did know that the police department was right across the street from this place that I'm parking. So I got a ticket, right? The police came and gave me a ticket for parking in this corner spot where there were little white lines. So now, is the best use of a police officer's time to look for small infractions to write a ticket that I eventually got off anyways? Because when it comes time to go to court and the court's like, they call my name and, I've got my no justice, no peace sign. I'm ready for my oral argument. And they're like, is the officer present? And they're like, no. And they're like, okay, case dismissed, right? So it's a trivial example, but it is, we have police officers who write tickets, right? Their job when we already have other people whose job it is to write tickets. So is that a good use of their time? I'm sure you can do a better example than that, Adam. What's another thing that you know of that, for example, we don't need the police to be doing? It could be something else that we have somebody else who's already doing it in their profession or even in their job.
I mean, the simple answer is a whole lot, because there's when people think about the public safety, people tend to think about it as something that is out of our control, that we don't have any say over. Public safety is a public good. If you call 911, you don't get a chance to say, I want officer so-and-so to show up, not this officer. It's compulsory, meaning that you're going to be subject to whoever shows up to provide the service, as opposed to if you go to the doctor, you get to say, I want this doctor, I want this treatment from this specific person. So since public safety is a public good, then that means that we should exercise some kind of accountability and oversight of our department. And there's a lot of instances where, the community is just not informed or involved in a lot of the decision-making that happens, because to your point, there's no accountability on one end. And also they're given all these tasks that they're tasked with completing, and they can't fulfill them because they don't have the requisite training. And also the way that policing is done in this country is very much steeped in racism and white supremacy. And so there's lots of instances where police are doing things that they should not be doing, and they should not be funded to do. I've had very personal experiences with people that I know, with people in my family who've had mental health challenges, and they've had the police called on them. And luckily, they weren't injured or assaulted as a result by police or brutalized. But there are lots of instances where calling the police should be the last option, if an option at all.
That's right.
And there's other examples too. Because in Baltimore, I think Baltimore specifically has been ahead of the curve as it pertains to doing a lot of these anti-violence measures that aren't with police. Like we have safe streets here in Baltimore. We also have a highly effective anti-violence initiative called the Baltimore Ceasefire. And so, and matter of fact, there was a study done on the Baltimore ceasefire when they call ceasefires, I believe, for a year, Q1, Q2, Q3. And there was a scientific study done that says the Baltimore ceasefire scientifically helps decrease violence in Baltimore. And so these are institutions and efforts that if they had more resources, they even had half or a third or fourth of what the Baltimore City Police Department has, then the community could take control of its own safety, its own destiny as it pertains to public safety. But
Right.
there's all these chances and opportunities to do that. But because the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, is so steeped in its racist practices. I mean, it's like they're like the Donald Trumps of Baltimore. They release a racist statement, once a week or every couple of weeks, just because that's just the culture of the department.
Yeah.
So there's all these opportunities to invest in things like that. And we have them available to us. And there are Black people in community that are doing highly effective anti-violence programs, but they can't get investment. So there's lots of, to answer your question, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of people who should get more investment. And, we don't need as many police, if any at all.
That's right. We also have, I know there are a number of social workers and psychologists who are watching, and that's another example, quite frankly, right? You have folks who have mental challenges that need intervention. I would also say mediation, right? We call the police when there's an argument between, I remember my neighbor called the police because her daughter was out of control. What she really needed was a mediator, a conflict, somebody who can help with conflict resolution. And that's a real skill. That's a real profession that the police are not fully trained in. Yet they're our only go-to. There's rarely anything else. There's no other go-to quick call, somebody can come out and send a car, right? Force that we've developed like the police. We've put all of our eggs in that one basket. We have a question around sort of what would be the ideal outcome if we succeed in defunding the police, and what would this look like, and how much money could be redistributed and to what, right? So, that's the question, right? So when you ask that question, you also have to think about what you want to see. Think about your own daily interactions, right? When you see the police and you wish there was another way, right? I don't know about you, but every time I'm driving and I see a Black person pulled over, I hold my breath, right? There have been times where, I remember one time I was at the Inner Harbor in Baltimore City, and the police had a young Black boy. There were 4 of them, cornered him, and I walked up to him and I said, "Is everything okay here?" Right? Now, if this young man, let's say, was being disorderly, let's say it was during the school hour and he was supposed to be in school, let's say that he was lost. There's so many different things that could have been that this young man was being nonviolent, which is what it appeared. And the only recourse that at least was taken up in that moment was to call the police. And especially knowing the history and the current predicament with the police and Black people in particular, we shudder at times to call the police. Sometimes we need to call someone to intervene, but we know there's also a risk at calling the police. What if there was someone else we could call? What would those who are watching, what else would you want to see? Anything, anyone. It could be, grandmas on call to come in and de-escalate. It could be trained mediators. It could be health professionals. It could be social workers. It could be nurses, right? There are a number of different institutions that are already created that are part of the government. And like you said, Adam, those that are community-based that could also and should be funded, right? Because let's remember, for us who are watching, where does the money come from for the police? We often forget that, I think, Adam, right? Like we forget that the government is funded. Every choice on where we put our money is our money, right? There is no money without the community's money. And yet the community, when you think about how twisted it is, right? The community is funding its own terrorization.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is actually really, there's two different points I want to make. One's not as controversial, one might be a little controversial depending on who's watching. But first,
Dive in.
so to your point though about people imagining what they want to see instead of police. One of the things that I think is important is that to this point of infrastructure, because I think that people probably do have a pretty good vision about what they would like instead. If they were asked, I feel like Black people would be able to communicate effectively what we would like instead of police. It's the question of what do we have at our disposal at the moment that we can invest in that could actually be more effective at meeting the need of community safety. Because, there's people around, there's people I've met, people that are community advocates, folks who are just, regular working class Black people who live here. And when you ask them those questions, to my earlier point, most people can't even conceive of a world where that's even possible. Not because they don't want the police, not because they want more police necessarily, because most of us kind of intuitively know the things that happen to Black people when you're dealing with the police. But it's a matter of what do we even have at our disposal to imagine something different. Yeah. And I think it's because of the system of white supremacy, some of the internalized notions of structural racism, right, that we don't actually see it. Mm-hmm, exactly. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, I mean, and there's another part of what you said about, instead of it being the police, these other types of institutions. I think we do have to have a revolutionary mindset and a revolutionary framework as it pertains to what policing would be if it wasn't calling the police, because in many different ways, this is an industry and a structure that is set up to benefit very specific folks. So it's not just the Baltimore City Police Department that benefits from having $500 million in its budget. The contracts, the people that they pay, the companies that maintain their internal systems. There's a variety of institutions in Baltimore and the state that benefit from their relationship to law enforcement. Right. And so it's not just about being able to like if the task was to defund the police department, in my perspective, funding University of Maryland to send out social workers is also, that's a part of the problem, is that that's a white institution. It's an institution we don't have control over. As it pertains in the healthcare industry, like there's a variety of institutions that Black people just don't have the access and the power to determine how they administer services to us.
But when I actually said like psychologists and social workers, I wasn't even really thinking about the institutions that provide those or that house. I was literally thinking about Black psychologists and Black social workers, right? That I know who are on this call who are right now working, right, in one entity or another, but could and maybe would work in a grassroots home-based entity that was more about servicing their people, their own community. Right. That was developed by the
that's
community.
A question of infrastructure.
Pay them, right? Because right now, sometimes I think we think, if I'm doing anything related to community work, can I make can I survive, right? But we allow our tax dollars to fund people who don't live in our communities, who don't have our community at interest, right? And so it's not necessarily, I agree with you, it's not necessarily about going to a University of Maryland or another institution to be able to now infiltrate, right? But it's really looking at the resources that we do have in the Black community that we often don't tap into because they're not institutionalized.
Exactly. And you know what, that's a great, I think that's a great segue to the other point, because again, to your point, there are lots of Black people who work in institutions that could, in many different ways, contribute substantively to, helping the community be safer. But I think we got to stop. We have to kind of zoom out and see the whole table and see how there are civic institutions, civic organizations, white liberals, and other white leaders and white infrastructure that are invested in maintaining the systems that are in place. So one example would be, also there's two different examples of how this plays out in Baltimore. And so there's a white woman, she actually recently resigned, I believe, from Mayor Young's administration, Cheryl Goldstein, I think her name is. And Cheryl Goldstein, a lot of people don't know her name. A lot of people will never heard who she is, probably couldn't put her out in the lineup, Google her name, that she probably wouldn't come up in the search results. But Cheryl Goldstein is a white woman that in many different ways has been directly and indirectly responsible for a lot of the things that are happening with the Baltimore Police Department. Most people don't know about her participation in the Police Executives Research Forum, PERF for short. And PERF has had direct influence over the police budget and also the police commissioner, who's been the police commissioner. I believe the only police commissioner that has not been either a member or part of PERF formerly was Commissioner D'Souza, who of course went to jail for tax evasion. And so, and that organization is designed to take over cities through their budget. So you said in the beginning, you know, you had to decrease your spending when you were director because and stop your spending altogether because they already overspent their budget. And so that kind of power and influence is not happenstance. Cheryl Goldstein, through her direct participation in PERF and her membership in multiple mayoral administrations, has been directly involved with that. And I think a little tidbit that might be interesting to some of the viewers, you know, people are familiar with the Gun Trace Task Force, you know, one of the most corrupt units that we've ever seen in any police department in the country. You know, stealing from people, robbing people, planting evidence, the whole
And if
gamut.
you don't know about it, Google it, okay? Because oftentimes we think that these stories, right, of police brutality and terrorization are just that. And we've heard them and we say, that can't be true. Get out of here. Well, I know such and such. But it is, right? And it somehow gets validated, unfortunately, when it is in the paper. And when somebody sort of writes a report on it and says, yes, this did happen, right? The community is known for years and has been crying out for years that this has been happening.
Exactly. So it's very consistent. It's very consistent with what we already know to be true of any police department in the country. And with her specifically, the reason why I bring her up is that she I believe in the Mayor Dixon's administration, she was the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, I believe. I think that was her official title. And so during that time, she started, she didn't begin this program, but under her administration, they began a program called GunStat. And GunStat the purpose of the program was to actually find illegal guns in the city. And so, and then to arrest the perpetrators of, you know, violent crime. Over time, Cheryl Goldstein was able to help find resources for that office, for that effort, find resources for GunStat. And they actually created a task force in the police department that we now know as the Gun Trace Task Force that propagated all of that corruption. But the thing is, that is a white person who people do not know that works for all these institutions, that has been able to create a profile for herself and gathered and been a direct participant in the brutalization of our people by supporting its department in some of its practices, but no one knows who she is. And there's people like her. And the second example I'd say would be Bob Embry from the Able Foundation, because Bob Embry is
calling names, y'all. He calling names.
You got to, because people like Bob Embry, he, you know, for people who are unfamiliar, you know, he runs the Able Foundation, and people like him over the years have supported the police department through philanthropically, through resources that he's given to the department for specific efforts. There's always been, and he in many ways is a really strong representative of, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex and being a part of that political that control, that white political control over what happens in Baltimore. And that's not just with law enforcement, but a variety of things. And so people like him, people like Cheryl Goldstein, these are white people that are the ones that are guiding how our department operates. And so when these questions of defunding the police come up, it's people in their networks, it's people like them that are either pushing back against that idea or directly involved with a lot of the, for propagating a lot of the corruption. So I just feel like it's important that we're just clear that it's not just that Black people don't want public safety, or that we don't have a good imaginations and that we don't want different. It's an industry, it's a structure, and we have to attack it with a structural thrust. Otherwise, you know, it's going to be just more community policing. You know, that's what.
Yeah, there are forces in the works, right? Not just the police, right? Not just the government structure, but there are those behind the scenes, as you mentioned, both private and other public players who are well invested in what the police do and how the police operate, right? And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes those people are not in the paper. They don't come to hearings or community.
Mm-hmm.
They don't serve on the boards, but nothing happens without their okay. And I
Yep.
think that um, one of the things that makes this conversation so important right now is that this is the time for folks to really to learn, like, and speed learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the work is at play. And just as we're having CNN and the protests, which are all really vital to bring attention to this issue in ways that I think it hasn't been before, we can't let the conversation be directed based on what others are saying, right? And
Yep.
what the
Yep.
interpretation is, and have them drive the conversation without us having these conversations ourselves and ourselves being able to explore and be innovative in what could be, right? Not being limited by what is or who is, but what could be in our ideal world, and really give ourselves the opportunity to have that space,
Yep.
right? It is
Exactly.
bold and it is also very necessary. It is necessary for each of us to
Mm-hmm.
really be able to give ourselves the opportunity to explore what could be, right? Um, Somebody wrote in the comments about we need the police in some form. There have been numerous research studies that show when police engage with community members and get to know them and understand the community cultures, there is less violence, crimes being committed, and arrests. Yes, it's a
Yeah.
that's a valid, it's a valid perspective, right? I think the point that I was making really speaks to that, right? Because I think there is no bottom line, my perspective. There is no hard stop. There is no ceiling. There is no cage. We really can think about what else can be besides what we see in blue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And remember who's doing these studies, right? Sometimes we take to heart as gold the empirical information that white supremacy lives off of, right? They will find a study and a stat for anything, and oftentimes we have to be very aware of who's doing the research, who's presenting it, and how are they presenting it, and like you noted, who's funding that research, right? Sometimes that changes the dynamics of what is even being considered. Um, and it's not to say that there is not a role for a person who has the
Mm-hmm.
authority to arrest someone based on certain circumstances, right? For the public safety and the public good. Um, so I don't think that, at least for me, I'm not saying that there is no one with that authority, but what we have now is not working. It does not
Well,
work for me. It does not work for my community.
well,
Yeah.
I think to your point, there if that were true,
If
then why isn't it? If it were true that when police do this we have better outcomes. They when they do engage in police community policing, and they talk to community, they live in the community. Like, if that were true, then the question is, why do the conditions persist? And I think that that's the part that we want to skip over. I think what people like to do, and this is not really to the person making the comment. This is just really a more, it's a much larger meta understanding of how the systems work. Because if that were the case, then we would just, if all we needed were the right arguments, the most articulate version of what our police department should look like, then then we should be able to have better departments across the United States. Part of the problem is that it's political, and it's political for a lot of reasons. And I believe, an example of that, the Fraternal Order of Police, the FOP, the police union, for just about every major law enforcement agency in the United States, is the most powerful, one of the most powerful lobbying organizations,
Yeah.
period, in the world. And when you try to change anything that relates to policy or law, when it comes to law enforcement accountability, the FOP has it's almost like an unbreakable wall you can't get through, because the politicians are terrified of them,
Yeah.
and because their dues for the organization are paid by the public money that they get for the contracts that they have with the city. Like, every police officer, if they decide to pay into it, they pay into the dues for the FOP. So it's essentially a publicly subsidized lobbying organization. And that has nothing to do with that has nothing to do with should we do something different. That's a structural problem, and it's the leadership a lot of times of these institutions that are really perpetuating a lot of the problem. And so at a much higher level, there's the FOP. It needs to be as an entity as we currently understand it. Then we need to actually either remove it entirely. It needs to be abolished in and of itself. And the way we even relate to having these kinds of conversations about resources and policing need to change fundamentally. But I think that what people would like to say is that all we need is better training. We need better policies internally. Like that's what the Baltimore consent decree is. That's what that is. I mean, the 2016 Department of Justice report reported some of the same things that happened with the gun trace task force. There were essentially a lot of those things were happening department wide as a result of that report. That's why we have the federal consent decree. But because people aren't focusing on legislation and dealing with the FOP, it's like let's tinker around the edges internally with the police department and let's make things better internally. But once Commissioner Harrison, Mayor Young leave, and other administrations come in, those things could very well change. And those things are subject to the whim of the leadership that is currently by the elected leadership in the city. So these are things that can change over time. Legislation, when it's codified into law, it's a much different story. You can't alter that,
Yeah. Camille made a point about making them live in the communities, police, making them live in the communities that they patrol, because you have a lot of white officers who are terrified of the Black neighborhoods they patrol. And when they're scared, they act out of fear, and that equates to murdering us, essentially. I know in Baltimore City, we have quite a bit of police officers, the majority, but we have quite a bit of police who don't live in the city, but ironically, who also live in Pennsylvania, right? So they're not just living, 2 miles outside of the city, but literally living in a different state and coming to Baltimore City for the training, for the excitement, quite frankly, if you will, that they perceive in working in an urban environment, and then being able to take that training and go elsewhere. What would you say, Adam, to the notion of whatever we look at changing and how we change it, and redesigning the police, how strongly do you feel about whatever this new entity or this new person or these new ideas being connected to the communities that they serve? How important?
I believe that's a no-brainer. That's like we can't start the conversation with should police live in the city? Like, yeah, and what else? Like, you should, if you are police, if your job is public safety, if you are to administer public safety and to guard communities in a city, you should be invested in being there at bare base minimum. It's just that in many ways, they've been able to get around that because of a lot of the discrimination laws, and there's lots of laws in place that make it harder to mandate that. But I agree. It makes perfect sense for them to live in the city. But in addition to that, the entities, the entity that's designed at the end of the day, I think that the problem is that people are imagining much better versions of the status quo. You know what I mean? Like, if you are unable to see beyond the status quo, then it's like, well, okay, well, maybe if it's like the consent decree. Like, the consent decree in practice is a more robust reimagining of what we already have at the moment, as opposed to changing. And as an example, like Maryland, we have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, a bill codified 1974. One of 16 states in the United States that have a law like that essentially give police more privileges than regular civilians. And that law by itself, there's lots of things codified in that law alone that make it extremely difficult for civilians to have oversight. Because that, to me, in addition to defunding the police, there's infrastructure, but then there's also oversight. The most effective way to beat back police brutality and police violence is to have civilians involved at every level of the oversight process, not just other law enforcement. But those are all things that are legislative. Like, it is purely legislative. Like, and when people talk about the other things, like, let's try to have a conversation or community dialogue, or let's have more community-based training. Like, at this point, it's like what are we talking about if we didn't talk about that? You know what I mean? That's kind of how I've been feeling over the years, because I feel like now it's like people are demanding that things be changed, and it's like, man, like literally, this has been what people have been saying, not just us. Like, there's been people for the past 5 years, 6 years or so that have been saying that, but we can't get it done, and it's not because there's no political will. It's because of the FOP, because of the political establishment.
Well, there isn't political will, right? You've got the folks who are talking out of both sides, because if the political will was there, then it would be done. But there isn't,
Exactly.
because people, right, don't want to ruffle the FOP. Ironically, even in a state like Maryland, folks, you got to remember, Maryland has 2-to-1 Democrats, and FOP usually vote Republican. And mind you, remember I told you, most of these people don't even live here. So you're so afraid of an institution of folks who don't even vote your party and don't even vote in this state. That's how much control, right, this lobbying force has. And so, somebody asked earlier about, whether there was a Baltimore, Maryland politician who was in line with defunding. And I will say, out of the protests that have been happening, a lot of different states have elected officials who have said, hey, come the legislative season, we're going to do something. We got some stuff in the works. Here in Maryland, the head of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate from out of Montgomery County has said that he wants to see something, as well as the House Speaker, House Speaker Jones here in Maryland. But nevertheless, both are Black, by the way. But nevertheless, it still behooves us. Like, if you're on this live chat, it is up to you to at least have one eye open, with whoever is so-called representing you on this issue. Because if you're here today, you might as well be like, so what do you think about defunding the police? And don't let them give you any half-ass answer, because you yourself are starting to have conversation and do your own investigation into what is possible. And if something is limitless, if there are multiple possibilities and somebody gives you one answer, one choice, you already know there's a problem. You already know they're giving you a very narrow sliver of what is possible. So in Maryland, for example, we start our legislative session in January to April. So for all of you who are in Maryland, that's the time to tune in, and actually beforehand, because guess what? November, there's an election. So if you don't know how they stand on defunding the police, you better check on where they stand. I would say 2 parts, right? The law, right, through the legislative process. And then as a lawyer, one of the things that I think is imperative is for us to really be able to be connected to Black lawyers, and Black lawyers to be connected to our communities, because the law is defended and defensible by those who are instructed in that courts, in the legal system. And I often liken the notion of a Thurgood Marshall coming out of law school, right? And before he was the great, honorable Thurgood Marshall, and he just came out and Black folks were like, we got you. When we have an issue, we're going to come to you. And when he came out of law school, he was like, I got you. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to engage on behalf of the Black community. And so it behooves us on both sides, both the community to engage Black lawyers and hold us accountable, and for Black lawyers to stand up for our communities. Asher had, that was the question about, I got to that, Asher. And then Kalila, what are you guys' thoughts on establishing additional political parties? Oh boy, to shake up our status quo with the Democratic Party that acts red depending on the day. That's a great question. I think I used to be Director of Legislative Affairs for the Attorney General here in Maryland. And I found that here, even though I mentioned we are 2-to-1 Democrat, which would make us a blue state, we often act very purple, right? We are still below the Mason-Dixon line, although we are known as the Free State. Ha ha ha. I don't know. That came to be. It's like the opposite of, it was like opposite. Like, we're slave, but let's say we're free to trick them. I mean, so we're really purple. And so the idea of establishing additional political parties, right, to give folks options on defunding the police and other things, is on the table. What would you say, Adam?
I actually think it's not that. For some people, when that question comes up, think it's like it's almost impossible. Like, man, like we can't do that because it's insurmountable in terms of the work it would take to do it. But just one statistic, Black people make up a third of the state population, you know, and most of us are Democrats. So in the instances where we're holding the Democratic Party accountable, that we should hold our votes hostage from them, and we should hold them accountable. And if they don't do what we want, then we should build institutions and infrastructure that can do so. I think that is again, it comes back to the same question of what can we do to build the infrastructure that will accomplish the goals of transforming the material conditions of Black people. And I think that's the part that we always kind of go over. We always hop over the part, and because people like the rhetoric of, and Kalila, you know, she of course knows this. She of course knows that, like, you know, that's what our community often does too. She's like, well, you know, why don't we just create our own institutions, our own infrastructure, if they're not supplying what we want? I mean, if you apply this analysis to the presidential election that's currently happening, you know, there is not one Black person I know that is satisfied with Joe Biden. There's not one Black person I know that would like to have him in office.
You mean under the age of like 50, right? Because my
Right.
grandparents have been down from day one. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so there's people that are dissatisfied with, you know, Joe, like people like him and other folks, but how do we hold them accountable? And, you know, I think you only need like 10,000 signatures to actually start a party. But there's also another point of what you said earlier about the state representatives. You know, if you're in Maryland, you know, there's 5 names you should know right now if you want to just get involved with the issue of you know, defunding the police, but not just that, police accountability. One is Bill Ferguson. He's the current president of the state Senate, and all the legislation will come through his chambers as it relates to police accountability. Make sure he sticks to what he said in the media about wanting to do that. Speaker Adrienne Jones. She is the current Speaker of the House, the first black person and the first woman to lead that chamber. Same thing like Bill Ferguson. The legislation that's going to be happening as a result of a lot of the public demonstrations and outrage is going to be going through a chamber as well. And she actually created a task force to address these issues, which is chaired by the third person, Vanessa Atterbury. Vanessa Atterbury is a delegate from Howard County, and she's going to be responsible on that task force to make sure that police accountability legislation that community wants goes through. So we have to hold her accountable. The last two are Delegate Luke Clippinger and Senator Will Smith. These two gentlemen lead the committees in both the House and the Senate for the judiciary, meaning that any criminal justice legislation or police accountability legislation that we want passed has to go through their committee. And so these are and means before it even gets to the governor's desk and goes to the full chambers, it'll go through their 2 committees. And so we have to make sure that we hold them accountable as well. And these are things that we can do when January hits. Like, I'm gonna remember, like, what they say now, keep that same energy. I mean, I'm gonna be hitting people like you was talking about changing them laws. So I'm saying, you know, we can do it right now.
Yeah.
Hey, pull up the post. You're like, hey, I think you
It says here, I want to ask folks who are on, do you think it's possible to build trust between the current police system as we know it and the Black community moving forward? So either yes or no, maybe so. I'd love to hear, you know, how you came in and what you know now and what you're thinking. Do you think that building the type of trust to be able to say, no, we don't need to defund anything. We don't need to redesign anything. We just need to work on trust. Do you think it's even possible to build trust that could actually effectuate the type of change that people want to see? So I'm going to give you a minute to put in your votes, where you're at, your thoughts. I'm going to give this, so the same town, right? So just to show you about when we talk about defunding, like how obscure we think about folks on the beat. This same small town probably has like, I don't know, hundreds of people, not thousands, hundreds. They have a town hall, they've got over 20 police cars, and they also have a tank. So when I parked my car, I saw a tank. Now you say to yourself, what does a small town in Prince George's County need a tank for? So when we talk again about defunding the police, right? We connect back to the federal government who's handing out tanks to small towns. All of this stuff gets to be on the table that we don't often think about. That's a part of this police complex. So we got a lot of no's, nopes, hell no, got a hell no. Yeah, got to give a hell no. I do want to give an opportunity. So we talked about the FOP because I know it's getting a little late past folks' bedtime because, you know, your girl was a little bit technologically challenged. But I agree, you know, Tam, that it is understandable to be afraid of the unknown. But we already know what we know and it's not working for us, right? Something has to shift, right? We as Black people especially cannot survive in this status quo. We've been making it, right? We deserve a shift. We deserve a change in order to actually get closer to our own freedom, our own liberation. Having somebody walk these streets who has the ability to do what we see every day, caught on camera and nothing happened, we know that something's wrong, right? Oh, good question. What is Justice Connection, right? So
what is Justice Connection, Keisha?
Justice Connection, right? Justice Connection is it's the only legal, fundamentally, it's the only legal referral service that one is founded by, run by Black people, and promotes Black lawyers, right? So I liken it to if you're going online, you're looking for a lawyer, or if you're looking for a plumber and you go to Angie's List, it's sort of the Angie's List for Black lawyers, just breaking it down, right? And for me, I started it because I was constantly asked, hey, do you know somebody who does X? Do you know somebody who does Y? People looking for lawyers. And oftentimes I didn't know somebody off the top of my head, right? I would then go text 5 Black lawyers, hey, do you know somebody who does Y or Z? And within hours or even days, I maybe get a name or two and they'd be like, call Tina, maybe she can help you. And I just felt like we won as Black lawyers, we were leaving our communities most vulnerable by not being better connected, not being a better resource. We have tremendous expertise in the Black legal community, everything from taxes to criminal law to wills, trusts and estates, business law, contracts. We do it all. I tell you, one of the things in building this network of lawyers is really just discovering my own, of the colleagues of Black lawyers. I'm focused right now in DC, Maryland, Virginia. We have over 500 lawyers in our database, which I believe is more than any other legal referral service for Black lawyers. So we're here to empower Black communities and being able to be better connected to legal resources. So you can go to JUSTIS Connection. We definitely want you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and of course on Instagram as well. We connect Black lawyers to organizations, to individuals, to churches, right? To be able to bring information, right? It doesn't always have to be when you're in a jam that you're like, oh, I need a lawyer. Let me go and get one. Anybody know one? You know, you should be able to know where to go, even if the sugar honey iced tea don't hit the fan, right? And let us be that trusted referral, that place that you can go to for legal information and legal resource and legal counsel. So when we talk about how do we combat police brutality, right, which has kind of led us to this defunding conversation, at least right now. I think it was Misha asked earlier, what do you do when you see police brutality? And I will tell you, it is a tricky bag, right, especially for Black people. For non-Black people, especially white people, it's a different experience, right? Oftentimes they can engage with police without fear of retribution. More times than not, Black people hold a fear, rightfully so, based on experience, quite frankly, that if you engage with the police in a way that is trying to intervene, you yourself can be pulled in a very detrimental way. Even for the person who is experiencing police brutality, their options are very limited in that moment, right? Because even if something's going
Mm.
wrong, it is a choice, a personal choice in that moment, how you handle it. I know from working with the Civilian Review Board, the reality is that oftentimes your complaint, your cry, your protest go unheard of in the system, which is why I think it is so important to build this network of Black lawyers and empower Black lawyers to also know that they can rely on and relate and connect to our communities and be able to engage them in things like police brutality. Because quite frankly, a lot of Black lawyers and lawyers in general don't engage in this practice because it is an uphill battle, right? We've seen time and time again how
Mm.
even with the video of showing police brutality, that it goes nowhere. No one is punished, right? No retribution is made. And we see now there are certain Black lawyers who have made it their business to engage in this work consistently around the country, and make a name for themselves on it. And I think that there will be more Black lawyers who step forward and engage in this practice. And that's a really important part of this whole process, right? Because each and every one of us play a part in how we tackle the system and bring about change. So just as we have Adam working on the ground, doing the important work, not only in the community, but also in the legislative halls, you need Black lawyers, you need lawyers to engage in the court system to push the courts. Because I'm going to tell you, even though you've got all these things with cases and situations around police brutality, when you hit folks in their pocketbook, right, and start to really, because the city of Baltimore pays out millions of dollars a year,
Mm-hmm.
right, paying people out for the brutality that police have been convicted on, or have been not convicted on, who have been settled, because most of it is really just settled, like, oh, let's just pay these people off, we're better off that way. They pay millions of dollars. These cities, even the towns, the small towns and cities, pay big money because of the police. And mind you, when they're paying these big money cash outs, it's our money. So get this, we're paying for the police to brutalize and terrorize us, and then we turn around and pay the victims, right? Again, because the city doesn't want to go any further with it, and it's easier to just pay it out. So when we actually really push that, because that's there are a very small percentage of cases that are brought by lawyers before the city. And if we really were strategic around pushing that envelope and holding cities and police departments accountable on the back end with monetary judgments, that might also be a way to put pressure on governments to change and look at seriously defunding, because then Adam becomes their best friend. Brother, tell us more about your ideas on defunding the police.
Mm-hmm.
We redesign this because they're killing us on the back end, right? Paying everybody out. But I see we're at 9:41. So I'm gonna, if there's any more questions, put them in the chat really quick. But I want Adam, you to be able to tell folks how they can get engaged with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, how they can follow and learn more information, especially if you're here in Maryland, or even if you know of other resources that people can connect to learn more or hear more about this issue.
Sure. Appreciate it. Again, appreciate you for the invitation tonight. If folks have heard anything that sounds interesting to them, or want to get involved with what's happening, so, like I've said at the top, LBS, we are a think tank or political advocacy organization. And so most of the work that we do is at the legislative and policy level. And so what's going to be happening next, as these protests and all these things have died down some, they're still going on, but they've died down some. From January to April, like Keisha mentioned, is the Maryland General Assembly. That is where all the state legislators convene to discuss and pass laws around the state of Maryland. Any legislation dealing with police accountability or criminal justice reform has to go through the state legislature. And if you're interested in doing that here in Baltimore, then that's where you have to be. It's kind of the bottom line. And so there are lots of opportunities for people to get involved. And we actually have produced a lot of things on our website that can walk through folks who may be unfamiliar with a lot of these dynamics. So I would strongly encourage that folks check out our website, not just to find out about LBS, but to also just read about some of the things that we've talked about over the years as it relates to that. And it might just be a good place to start for folks who just kind of want to dive deep into it. So our website is www.lbsbaltimore.com. And if anyone is interested in reaching out to me personally, my email is adam@lbsbaltimore.com. You can find LBS on all social media at LBS Baltimore. And you can find me on social media at Smart Black Man. So, oh yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks so much. Ooh, Tria, real quick. You're for defunding, but not sure how fast it can happen. Do we need to go through reforms first, or can we go straight to abolition of police? Still so much I need to learn, and appreciate you both so much for this combo. Thanks, Tria, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. This is not the end. We'll keep you posted. Definitely stay connected to Justis. That's here on our Facebook, our Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and you can subscribe also for our newsletter on our website, and that's JUSTIS, justisconnection.com. Once again, Adam, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your patience, for chiming in, for your thoughts, your comments, and your ability and your willingness, not your ability, but your willingness to imagine, right? And to give yourself some space to think about what this world could look like, what our communities could look like if we just think outside of the box. So with that, we'll sign off. I'm gonna play this song. I love this song by Kindred the Family Soul, All My People. It's a good one. I'll let everybody just leave as they will. I'll just stay here and rock out for a while. Adam, you're welcome to stay with me. You're welcome to go. I'll catch you later if you want. This is my jam. I want all my people around me. Live a free, good life. Enjoy your weekend. I know I will. All good times. Everybody living good.
All right, homie.
Good. Everybody chilling. I want all my people around me. Everybody living good. Everybody feeling good. Everybody